I never thought my life would take such a strange turn when I agreed to care for an 8-year-old Apache man in the middle of the Arizona desert. It was supposed to be a quiet job, a simple few weeks of helping an old veteran who needed someone to cook, clean, and make sure he took his medicine. That's what the agency told me when I signed the papers. But from the first moment I stepped onto his land, I realized this was no ordinary assignment. There was something about the place about him that felt heavier than the dry air itself, as if the land carried secrets it didn't want to share. The dirt road leading to his cabin stretched endlessly across a flat open valley, where the sun burned like a hammer and the wind carried voices that sounded almost human. By the time I reached the small wooden cabin, my throat was dry, my shirt clung to my back, and a thin line of dust covered my skin. The place looked ancient, built from weathered logs and patched tin. Smoke curled from a rusted chimney. An old pickup truck, half buried in sand, sat to the side. When I stepped out of the car, I noticed how still everything was. No birds, no movement, just the faint hum of heat rising off the earth. Then I heard him before I saw him, a low, calm voice behind me. "You're late." I turned, startled, and there he was, standing on the porch with a cane in one hand and a face carved deep with lines and stories. His eyes were sharp and steady, like he was looking through me rather than at me. I apologized, saying the directions were unclear, but he only nodded and turned back toward the door. "Doesn't matter," he said. "You're here now. That's what counts." Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, tobacco, and something else I couldn't place, something earthy and old. The walls were covered with strange symbols, dream catchers, feathers, and photographs that looked like they had been taken decades ago. A small fire crackled in a stone fireplace, even though it was blistering hot outside. He moved slowly, but with a kind of deliberate grace, like every motion had meaning. He told me his name, but it was long and in Apache, and he said I could just call him Chief. At first the work was simple. I'd cook meals, sweep the floors, and keep him company in the evenings while he told stories about his younger days. He spoke about his time serving in the Korean War, about losing his brothers, both in blood and in spirit. But as the days passed, his stories began to shift. He started talking about things that didn't sound like memories, they sounded like warnings. He spoke of the land waking up, of shadows that follow where the wind dies. I thought maybe it was the age, or maybe he was just lonely and liked to talk. But then little things started happening that I couldn't explain. The first was the knocking. It would come late at night around 2 or 3 in the morning, always from outside. 3 knocks, slow and spaced out, coming from somewhere near the back wall of the cabin. I'd go to check, but no one was there. The chief would just sit in his chair, unmoved, and say, "It's just the land saying hello." He said it so calmly as if it was nothing unusual. But the way his eyes followed the sound told me otherwise. Then came the dreams. I started having vivid ones, standing in an endless desert under a blood-red sky, hearing drums in the distance and seeing figures move in the sand. I'd wake up gasping, covered in sweat, the sound of chanting still echoing faintly in my ears. I didn't tell him about them at first, but one morning as I brought him his tea, he looked up and said, "They're starting to talk to you, aren't they?" I froze. I hadn't mentioned a word. "You're hearing them," he continued, "the ones who never left." His voice was low, almost mournful. "They don't like strangers here, not at first." After that, I started paying attention to everything. The wind that whistled through the cracks in the walls seemed to carry whispers. The old wooden floor creaked in patterns that sounded almost deliberate. Sometimes in the distance, I'd see faint lights moving along the horizon at night, too slow to be vehicles but too steady to be stars. Every time I mentioned it, he'd only say, "The desert remembers." One afternoon, while cleaning out the storage shed behind the cabin, I found an old trunk buried under tools and dusty blankets. Inside were yellowed papers, faded photographs, and a small bundle wrapped in deer hide. The bundle was tied with red thread, and a strange symbol had been drawn on the top. I didn't open it. Something about it felt wrong. When I told the chief about what I found, his face darkened. "Shouldn't have gone looking," he said. His tone wasn't angry, but filled with a kind of sorrow. "Some things are left buried for a reason." He asked if I touched the bundle, and when I said no, he simply nodded. "Good, then maybe they'll let you be." That night, the knocking came again, but this time louder, sharper, like whoever or whatever was outside wanted in. I stood frozen in my bed, listening. Then came a faint voice, almost childlike, whispering words I couldn't understand. I rushed to the chief's room, but he was already awake, sitting in the dark. "Don't open the door," he said softly, "no matter what you hear." The voice outside grew louder, pleading, almost crying. My hand trembled near the doorknob, but his words held me back. Eventually it stopped, and silence filled the cabin again. The next morning I found tracks in the dirt outside the back walls, small footprints, barefoot, circling the cabin. They looked fresh, though there was no one for miles. I felt a tightness in my chest that wouldn't go away. The chief didn't seem surprised. He just said, "They came to see if you're worthy." I asked who they were, but he only said, "Old ones. You'll know when it's time." Every day after that, the air around the cabin grew heavier, almost electric, as if the desert itself was waiting for something. The chief's health began to decline, and he started spending more time outside. Sitting in his old wooden chair, facing the mountains, he'd mumble in Apache, his voice mixing with the wind. One evening, I brought him water, and he looked up at me with those piercing eyes and said, "When I go, you'll see what I've seen." I didn't know what he meant until the storm came. It was sudden, a wall of dark clouds rolling over the desert like an army. Lightning cracked across the sky, and the wind howled so fiercely that I thought the cabin would tear apart. The chief called me to his side. "Go to the trunk," he said weakly. "Bring the bundle." My heart pounded as I fetched it. That same deer-hide package tied with a red thread. His hands trembled as he took it from me. "They're coming," he whispered. "Must not run." Before I could ask what he meant, the door rattled violently. The sound wasn't wind, it was knocking, louder than ever, shaking the walls. The fire went out, leaving the room in darkness except for flashes of lightning outside. I could see his face lit by the stormlight, calm, yet sad. "Now you'll understand," he said. Then he opened the bundle. What I saw inside made my breath catch, and in that instant the air in the cabin changed completely, like the desert itself was holding its breath. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. And as the thunder roared and the knocking grew louder, I realized that whatever was out there wasn't just coming for him. It was coming for me. When he opened the bundle, the room filled with a strange smell like rain on dry earth mixed with smoke and iron. Inside was a small wooden carving, no bigger than my palm. It was shaped like a bird, with feathers etched in such fine detail that they looked almost real. Its eyes were made of something dark and glossy, and for a second I thought they moved. The chief held it tightly, murmuring words under his breath that sounded ancient and rhythmic. Then, as lightning flashed again, the carving gave off a faint glow, a soft red pulse that flickered like a dying ember. I felt the hairs on my arms rise. The knocking stopped all at once, and the wind outside fell completely silent. The only sound was the chief's breathing, slow, shallow, uneven. His eyes were closed now, his lips moving around words I couldn't understand. I took a step closer, unsure if I should help him or back away. That's when he spoke, his voice so low I almost missed it. "They're here now," he said. "Don't be afraid of what you'll see." Then he went still. I stood there frozen, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. For a long moment, nothing did. The storm quieted, the air settled, and I started to think it was over. But when I turned toward the window, I saw a movement outside, figures standing in the distance, barely visible through the rain and darkness.
Ow.
They looked like shadows shaped into people, not moving, just watching. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to run, but something about the stillness held me in place. The old carving still glowed faintly in the chief's hand, casting a soft light across his weathered face. I called his name, but he didn't answer. I reached for his wrist. His pulse was faint, but there. Relief washed over me for a second before I realized that whatever he had called, whatever he had invited, wasn't finished yet. The lights outside the cabin flickered again, and in that instant, I saw one of the figures move closer. It didn't walk. It just seemed to shift forward, like the darkness itself bent around it. I backed away from the window, grabbed the flashlight, and shined it outside. Nothing. Just desert and rain. When I turned back around, the chief's eyes were open again, but they looked different, sharper, aware, filled with something I couldn't name. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered. I didn't sleep that night, sat by the fire watching him, afraid he might stop breathing, afraid of the silence pressing in from every side. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the desert glistening under the pale light. The chief was still alive, but weaker. He didn't talk much after that, only short phrases between long silences. He told me the carving was older than him, older than any name the land had. Said it was given to his people to remind them that the earth listens and that sometimes it answers. He wouldn't say who the figures were or why they came. All he said was that the land remembers every wrong, every broken promise, and that some debts can't be forgotten even after a lifetime. His words stayed with me. I tried to focus on my daily tasks, boiling water, tending the fire, writing notes in my journal, but there was a weight in the air that wouldn't lift. The next few days blurred together. The chief drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes muttering in Apache, other times speaking to someone who wasn't there. I'd hear him say things like, "Not yet," and "she doesn't understand." When I'd ask who he was talking to, he'd just shake his head. Once he pointed toward the window and said, "They're watching you now." I didn't look. I couldn't. The land around the cabin began to change too. The wind patterns shifted, carrying a deep humming sound late at night. The coyotes stopped howling, and even the crickets went quiet. I started feeling like I was being observed, not by the chief, but by the land itself. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. One evening, I walked to the edge of the valley to clear my mind. The sun was setting, turning the sky deep red, and the desert seemed endless and alive. I knelt near a rock formation that looked almost like a human face and noticed carvings on the stones, similar symbols to the ones inside the cabin. Some looked freshly cut, even though they were half buried in sand. When I ran my fingers over them, a strange vibration hummed through the rock like a heartbeat. It startled me enough to pull away. When I returned to the cabin, the chief was waiting by the door. "You touched the stones," he said. His voice wasn't angry, but disappointed, like a teacher scolding a careless student. "They'll see you now," he added quietly. I asked who they were, and he looked at me with tired eyes. "The ones before us. They protect what we forget." That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. I woke up to the sound of soft singing outside, low, melodic, and haunting. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language I knew. I peeked through the curtain and saw faint lights moving again across the valley, weaving slowly like lanterns in a distant procession. The chief was sitting up in bed, eyes open, humming along to the same tune. His voice blended perfectly with theirs, and for a moment the sound was beautiful, almost peaceful. Then it stopped. He looked at me and said, "They called you by name tonight." My skin prickled. "I didn't tell them," he added, "but they already knew." I didn't know how to respond, so I just sat there, silent. He smiled faintly. "Do you think this is about me? But it's not. The land chooses who it speaks to. You just happened to arrive when it was ready." The next morning, I found something strange outside the cabin door, a ring of small stones arranged in a perfect circle, each marked with a symbol carved into its surface. They hadn't been there the night before. When I asked the chief, he said it was a boundary, a kind of protection. "Don't break the circle," he warned. "Not for anything." But that night, the circle didn't help. The knocking returned, louder and faster this time, coming from all sides of the cabin. The windows rattled, the fire flickered, and a deep, vibrating sound filled the air like a drumbeat under the earth. Covered my ears and shouted for it to stop. The chief only whispered, "They're not angry. They're remembering." When it finally ended, the silence felt heavier than before. I walked outside at dawn and saw the footprints again, more of them, circling the cabin in perfect patterns. They led away into the desert, toward the direction of the mountains. That's when I realized the mountains weren't just mountains. Their peaks formed shapes, faces, hands, and wings like the land itself had been carved with purpose. Over the following days, the chief grew quieter, stopped eating, stopped speaking, and spent long hours staring at the horizon. Sometimes I'd find him tracing the carving surface with trembling fingers, whispering the same word over and over, "return." I started to feel the same pull he described, like the land wanted something from me too. I'd dream of standing in the desert again, surrounded by figures who waited without moving. In every dream, they stood closer. On the 10th day after the storm, I woke up to find the chief gone. His bed was empty, his cane leaning against the wall, his blanket folded neatly. Panic surged through me. I searched outside, calling his name, but the desert was silent. and I saw the circle of stones broken, one piece missing, the line disturbed. There were footprints leading away from it. One said his, the other small and light, like the ones I'd seen before. I followed them. They led me past the dry creek bed, past the rocks with the carvings, all the way to a shallow ravine where the ground shimmered in the morning light. And there, standing at the edge, I saw him. He was upright, facing the sunrise, the carving clutched in his hand. For a second I thought he was alive, but when I called out he didn't move. I took a step closer and then the ground beneath me gave a low rumble, deep and hollow. The wind rose suddenly, swirling sand into the air until I couldn't see. When it cleared, the chief was gone. No footprints, no sign of struggle, just the carving lying in the sand where he'd stood, glowing faintly in the sun. I picked it up, and the moment my skin touched it, a rush of warmth spread through me, followed by a whisper so soft it could have been the wind or something else entirely. Now the cabin feels emptier than ever. The nights are quiet, but not in a peaceful way. Still hear faint knocks sometimes, far off in the distance, like a reminder. The carving rests on the table beside me, and though it's cold to the touch, I can't shake the feeling that it's waiting. The chief once told me that the desert remembers everything, and I think I'm beginning to understand what he meant. Because lately, when I walk outside and the wind shifts just right, I swear I hear him calling my name again. After the chief disappeared, the silence around the cabin took on a strange weight. It wasn't just quiet, it was expectant, like the land was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Every sound seemed sharper, the crunch of sand under my boots, the whisper of the dry wind through the brush. Even my own heartbeat felt loud. I wanted to believe he'd simply wandered off, but deep down I knew better. The chief hadn't just left. He'd crossed into something else, something I wasn't supposed to see or understand. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and unease. I tried calling the agency, but the phone line was dead. My car wouldn't start either, the battery drained overnight for no reason. It felt like the desert wanted to keep me there. I rationed what little food I had left, boiling water from a nearby creek that sometimes shimmered faintly at night. I started marking time by the sun, keeping track of the days with scratches on the doorframe. On the third day, I noticed something new. Near the back of the cabin, where the footprints had always appeared, the earth was beginning to shift. A circle of ground had darkened, almost like a burn mark, and in the center, small green shoots were breaking through the sand. Life growing in a place where nothing ever grew. I stared at them, uncertain whether to feel comforted or terrified. The desert wasn't supposed to do that, not here, not after all the years of drought. Later that night, as I sat by the dim firelight, I heard something again. It wasn't knocking this time. It was a soft tapping, rhythmic, like someone walking slowly around the cabin. I held my breath and waited. The sound stopped, then started again closer. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped toward the window. The light flickered as I turned it on, weak and trembling. For a moment, I saw nothing but swirling dust. Then, in the beam's edge, I caught a glimpse of something pale, a hand, pressing lightly against the glass from the outside. I stumbled back, the flashlight dropping to the floor. The hand stayed there for a moment before sliding away. I rushed to the door, flung it open, and shined the light across the yard. No one was there, just the wind and the endless stretch of sand. I told myself I imagined it, that it was just my nerves, but when I looked at the window again, there were faint smudges on the glass, where the hand had been 5 perfect fingerprints made of fine gray dust. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that hand. In the morning, I went outside to check for footprints, but there were none. The ground looked untouched, except for the growing circle of plants, now taller, greener, and swaying, even though there was no breeze. Something about them drew me in. I knelt beside them, brushing my fingers against their leaves, and for a moment, I heard a low hum coming from the soil. It was faint, like the sound of a heartbeat deep underground. As I stood, I noticed something glinting near the edge of the circular piece of metal half buried in the dirt. I dug it out carefully and found an old locket, tarnished and cracked. Inside was a faded photograph of a young Apache woman standing beside a man in uniform. The man looked like the chief when he was younger. I turned the locket over, and on the back, carved with a shaky hand, were the words returned to where it began. The words followed me all day. I couldn't stop thinking about them. What did "where it began" mean? Was it the mountains he used to stare at every evening? The carved stones near the ravine? I needed answers, but the more I searched, the more questions I found. The chief had left traces of himself everywhere. Scraps of writing in Apache on the back of old receipts, symbols carved into the table's underside, and a faded journal tucked beneath his bed. Most of it was written in a language I couldn't read, but one page stood out. It was in English and said, "The watchers guard the crossing. The one who hears must decide which side to keep." I didn't know what that meant, but I had a feeling it was about me. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, I walked out to the same ravine where I last saw him. The light hit the rocks in such a way that the carvings seemed to glow faintly, as if lit from within. I ran my hands across them again, feeling that same vibration. This time, though, it was stronger. The ground beneath me pulsed like something alive. Then I heard a sound distant but unmistakable, like chanting carried on the wind. I followed it. It led me deeper into the ravine until I came upon a narrow cave opening hidden behind a cluster of dry bushes. Inside, the air was cool and damp. My flashlight beam caught glimpses of handprints painted on the walls, hundreds of them, in shades of red, brown, and black. Near the back, there was another carving, a bird with wings spread wide, the same shape as the wooden one the chief had kept. Beneath it were fresh markings, drawn in charcoal. I didn't understand their meaning, but standing there I felt the same pull I had felt when I first touched the carving. It was like something inside me was being called forward, something that wasn't entirely my own. I left the cave shaken, but unable to stay away. Every night after that, I'd find myself drawn to the ravine, listening to the faint hum of the earth. The more I listened, the clearer it became, like a distant song, low and ancient, echoing through the stone. I began to dream differently, too. The figures in the desert no longer stood still. They were moving now, walking toward me in slow, measured steps. In those dreams, the chief was always beside them, silent but watching. Back at the cabin, strange things started happening again. The circle of plants grew wider each day, and small birds began to gather near it, sitting quietly in the sand as if waiting for something. At night, the fire would burn blue, and the carving on the table would faintly glow whenever I passed by. I felt like the boundary between the living and the dead, between the real and the unreal, was fading, and I couldn't tell which side I was standing on anymore. Then, one afternoon, a truck appeared on the horizon. The sight of it filled me with relief and dread at the same time. When it stopped near the cabin, two men got out, both wearing ranger uniforms. One of them was older, with a sharp, weary face, and the other was younger, looking uneasy. The older man introduced himself as Ranger Clay and said they'd received a report that someone was staying on the old Apache reservation land. Told him about the chief, about how I was sent by the agency, and about his disappearance. Ranger Clay frowned. "There hasn't been an agency caretaker out here for years," he said. I froze. "This land's been closed off since the last elder passed away almost a decade ago." I tried to explain, showing him the cabin, the journal, even the carving. He examined it closely, then handed it back. "You should leave before nightfall," he said. "This place isn't safe after dark." When I asked why, he only said, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." They left before sunset, promising to come back with more help, but I knew they wouldn't. As the truck disappeared into the distance, I felt the same heavy stillness return. The sky darkened faster than usual and the wind picked up, carrying faint whispers again. I went inside, locked the door, and sat by the fire, holding the carving in my hands. That's when I heard it, the chief's voice. It was faint, almost like a memory, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. "You're standing where I once stood," he said. "Now it's your turn to see." The carving pulsed with warmth and the fire flared high, filling the cabin with red light. Outside, the knocking began again, louder than ever. But this time it wasn't just one sound, it was dozens, coming from every direction. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching the carving as the windows rattled and the earth itself seemed to tremble. The plants outside bent toward the cabin, their leaves rustling in unison. The air thickened, and for a moment I saw shapes moving in the firelight, faces forming in the smoke, eyes watching me. Then the voice spoke again, calm but commanding. "Return what was taken." The words echoed through the cabin and inside my head. I didn't know what it meant, but something in me understood that whatever was happening wasn't over it. It was only beginning. The land hadn't chosen me by mistake. I was part of the story now, bound to the same mystery that had claimed the chief. As the last of the light faded and the desert fell into darkness, I knew I couldn't leave. Not yet. The desert wanted its truth told, and somehow I was the one meant to find it. The night after the rangers left, the cabin felt smaller than ever. The walls creaked as if they were breathing, and the air inside was thick, heavy with smoke and dust. I sat near the fire, clutching the wooden carving in my hands, tracing its edges again and again. The faint hum that had followed me since the chief vanished was louder now, like the earth itself was speaking through the silence. Outside, the wind had stopped. The desert was still, too still, like it was waiting. The knocking began again, sharp and deliberate, shaking the thin window panes. I rose slowly, the carving warm against my skin, and whispered into the dark, asking who was there. The answer came not in words but in movement, the shadow of a figure passing just beyond the window, its outline distorted by the flickering firelight. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to step closer. When I pulled the curtain aside, I saw nothing, only my reflection in the glass, pale and trembling. Then, behind me, a voice whispered my name. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The cabin was empty. The chief's chair by the fire was still, yet I could smell the faint trace of tobacco, the same scent he used to carry on his clothes. My throat went dry. "What do you want from me?" I said out loud. The silence that followed felt alive, pressing against my chest. A sound came from under the floor, soft at first, then louder, like something shifting in the dirt beneath the cabin. I knelt and placed my ear to the wood. There it was again, a scraping noise, followed by a faint whisper. It wasn't wind. It was voices, overlapping, hundreds of them, murmuring in a language I didn't understand. I stood up too fast and stumbled back. The carving slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a dull crack. The fire flared at that exact moment, its flames rising twice as high. The carvings on the walls, the ones I had barely noticed before, began to shimmer. Lines of light crawled across them, forming new shapes, new patterns that seemed to move on their own. I could hear the chief's voice now, faint but clear. "Return what was taken." The words echoed again, this time from outside. Ran to the door, flung it open, and froze. The circle of plants that had been growing behind the cabin was gone. In its place was a dark pit, wide and deep, the earth around it still damp and steaming. The ground pulsed faintly, like it was breathing. I stepped closer, shining my light down, but the beam was swallowed by blackness. I couldn't see the bottom. The air smelled of metal and rain, even though the sky was dry. Something about that hole felt wrong. It wasn't natural, and I knew it hadn't been dug by hands. Thought about the chief's words, about debts that couldn't be forgotten. Maybe this was the place he meant, the place where it began. My skin prickled as I felt a shift beneath my feet, a low vibration moving through the earth. I backed away, but before I could reach the cabin, I saw movement at the edge of the ravine figures again, barely visible in the moonlight. There were more of them this time, standing in a line that stretched across the desert, their outlines flickering like heat waves. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. One of them was taller than the rest, standing slightly apart, and though I couldn't see his face, I knew it was him, the chief. My breath caught. I took a hesitant step forward, calling his name, but the wind swallowed my voice. He raised one hand, slow and deliberate, pointing toward the pit. Then everything went dark. The fire inside the cabin went out, the flashlight flickered and died, and the air turned cold in an instant. The kind of cold that doesn't come from temperature, it comes from something deeper. I felt it settle into my bones. The next thing I knew, the ground trembled again. The hole behind the cabin began to glow faintly red, and a low, steady hum filled the air. I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, like the earth itself was pulling me back. A sound came from the pit, soft at first, a whisper that grew into a cry, then into something like a voice. I could hear words forming, broken and distant. "Give it back," it said. "It does not belong to you." I didn't know what it wanted, the carving, the land, the truth. I picked up the wooden bird from where it had fallen and held it out, my hand shaking. "Take it," I said. "Just stop this." But nothing changed. The air thickened, the red light grew brighter, and I saw shapes moving in the glow, shapes that looked human but weren't. They climbed slowly, their forms shifting, made of dust and shadow. I stumbled backward toward the cabin, slamming the door shut and bracing it with a chair. The knocking started again, harder this time, shaking the whole structure. My heart raced as I pressed my back to the door, clutching the carving. I shouted for it all to stop, but the voices outside only grew louder, mixing into a deep rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Then, through all the noise, I heard another sound, a faint engine in the distance. Headlights flashed briefly across the valley. It was a truck. The Rangers had come back. Relief hit me like a wave. I yanked open the door, but when I stepped outside, the headlights vanished. The desert was empty again. No tracks, no sound. Just the hum from the earth and the endless stretch of dark. Panic started to take hold. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I called out for the chief, for anyone, but the only answer was the whisper of the wind. My flashlight flickered once more, and when it came back on, I froze. The figures were closer, no much closer. They stood just beyond the circle of light surrounding the cabin. I could see their outlines more clearly. Men, women, even children, all motionless, their faces hidden in shadow. And at the center of them stood the chief, his eyes glowing faintly. He looked different, older, but also stronger, his presence radiating something ancient and commanding. "You should have left when I told you," he said. His voice was calm, but there was no warmth in it now. "You've seen what wasn't meant to be seen." I tried to explain, to tell him I didn't mean to stay, but my words caught in my throat. He stepped closer, the others following behind him in silence. "This land remembers," he said again, his tone almost mournful. "It keeps what it's owed." I looked down at the carving, realizing for the first time that it had changed. The eyes were no longer dark and still, they glowed faintly red, just like the pit. The wood felt alive, pulsing faintly against my palm. I wanted to drop it, but something in me couldn't let go. The chief reached out a hand. "It's not yours to carry," he said softly. The wind rose suddenly, whipping sand into my face. The figures began to move around me, circling slowly, their steps soundless. The air buzzed with energy, the same deep hum that had followed me for days. I could feel it pressing in from all sides, pushing me toward the pit. My body trembled as I fought to resist it, but the pull grew stronger with every second. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the valley for an instant. And in that flash, I saw everything: the chief, the watchers, the pit glowing like a wound in the earth. The carving in my hand flared with light, burning against my skin. I cried out, dropping to my knees. The ground beneath me cracked, a sharp sound that echoed through the valley. The chief's voice rose above the wind. "You must choose," he said, "to return what was taken or to take its place." The words cut through the chaos, and for a moment, everything stopped. The wind, the noise, even the glowing light from the pit all froze, suspended in stillness. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I looked up at him, unable to speak, and in that silence I finally understood what he meant. But before I could move, before I could decide, the earth gave one last violent shudder, and the ground beneath my feet began to split open. The carving blazed in my hand, and the chief's eyes locked onto mine as he shouted something I couldn't hear. The light swallowed everything. And then, just like that, the desert went silent again. When I opened my eyes, everything was quiet. The first thing I noticed was the sky. It was no longer heavy with clouds or red with stormlight. Instead, it was pale and still, washed in soft morning gray. The air felt cool against my face, and the sand beneath me was damp as if rain had passed through during the night. I lay there for a long time, listening. No wind, no voices, no hum, only silence. When I finally sat up, the pit was gone. The ground where it had been was sealed and smooth, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The cabin stood a few feet away, untouched, its door swinging gently in the breeze that had just begun to move again. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed everything the light, the chief, the voices, but when I looked down at my hand, I saw the truth. The carving was still there, but it had changed. The glow was gone, and the wood felt cold now, lifeless, but its shape was slightly different. The bird's wings were open, spread wide as if ready to take flight. I turned it over, and at the base, where before there had been only smooth grain, were small carved symbols. I didn't know what they meant, but I knew they weren't there before. Something had shifted. The desert was no longer silent in that strange way it had been. It felt natural again, full of small sounds, the distant call of a hawk, the low hiss of wind moving through dry grass. I pushed myself to my feet, every muscle sore, and walked back toward the cabin. Inside, the fire had gone out completely. The floorboards were streaked with dust, and the chair I had used to brace the door lay on its side. I righted it, though I didn't know why. Maybe I needed something to feel normal again. I sat there for a while, trying to piece together what had happened. There were moments I could recall clearly: the chief standing in the circle of figures, his voice calm but unyielding, the blinding light from the carving, the ground breaking beneath me. And then there were parts that felt like dreams, half-remembered and strange. I didn't know where he had gone, or if those people I saw were ever really there. But deep down, I knew something had been set right. The land felt calmer, the air no longer pressed against my chest. The tension that had hung over this place for so long was gone. By noon, I decided to leave. I packed what little I had, some water, a flashlight, my notebook, and stepped out into the sunlight. The path that led toward the highway was clearer now, almost as if someone had swept the sand aside to reveal it. When I turned to take one last look at the cabin, I saw something that made me stop. Near the spot where the pit had been, a small patch of green had appeared, a single plant pushing through the dry soil. Its leaves were broad and bright, trembling slightly in the breeze. I didn't know if it would survive long in that desert heat, but it was growing all the same. The drive back through the desert felt different. The same road that had once seemed endless now felt peaceful, almost kind. I passed through the old valley where the chief had first spoken to me, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a figure standing near the edge of the ridge, watching. But when I looked again, there was no one there. It's only the shimmer of sunlight on rock. It took 2 days before I reached the edge of the nearest town. The people there didn't believe much of what I said. They thought I'd been out in the sun too long, that maybe I'd imagined most of it. I didn't argue. I just told them I'd found the old reservation site, and that it was time someone took care of it properly. They nodded politely, but I could tell they didn't really understand what that meant. Still, a few weeks later, I learned that the land had been closed off for conservation. No development, no digging. Protected forever. That felt right. At night, I often thought about the chief. I wondered if he had been real in the way people are real, or if he was something older, something the land had shaped to make its voice heard. His last words echoed in my head often: return what was taken. Maybe that wasn't just about the carving. Maybe it was about respect, about balance. The world has a way of remembering, even when people forget. Months passed, and I began to write about what happened. It's not as a ghost story or a legend, but as a recorder reminder that every place carries its history. And sometimes, that history still speaks. The first article I published was simple, just a reflection on my time in the desert, but it reached people. Messages began to come in from others who had felt something similar, people who had lived near old lands, places with stories that refused to fade. They said they understood. They said they had heard the same whispers in the wind. One night, while working late, I took out the carving again. The wood had dried and cracked a little, but it still held its shape. As I ran my fingers over it, I noticed something new, the faint scent of smoke and sage. It was subtle, but it was there. I smiled, unsure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks. Either way, it felt like a sign, a quiet acknowledgement from the chief, or from the land itself, that things were finally in balance again. Sometimes I dream about the desert. In those dreams, it's always the same time of day, just before sunset, when the light turns everything gold. The cabin is still there, though empty now, and that small patch of green behind it has grown. In the distance, I see the chief standing near the horizon, his back turned, watching the sky. He doesn't speak in those dreams, but he doesn't need to. Silence feels peaceful now, not heavy. I've come to believe that some places never truly let you go. They stay with you, not as fear or memory, but as a quiet reminder. The desert taught me that. It taught me that nature remembers its own balance, that everything we take leaves a mark somewhere. And sometimes, when the wind carries the right tone, it reminds us to listen. Years later, I returned once more, just to see it with my own eyes. The conservation fences had gone up, and there were signs posted that read, "Protected Cultural Land, Do Not Disturb." The path to the cabin was overgrown, but I followed it anyway. The building had begun to decay, the roof sagging, the windows clouded, but the air there was calm. The same patch of green had turned into a small grove of plants, blooming in a place where almost nothing should have grown. I placed the carving there, at the base of the plants, and whispered a thank you. The wood felt warm for a moment, as if alive again. When I stepped back, I noticed something unexpected. Near the grove stood a small wooden post, newly placed, with an inscription carved into it. It said, "Home returns to the ones who remember." I didn't know who had written it, but I felt its truth deep inside. As I walked away, the wind rose again, carrying the scent of dust and sage through the valley. It brushed against my face like a soft breath, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. I didn't need answers anymore. The story was complete in its own way, not tied neatly with reason or proof, but bound by something older and quieter. When I reached the ridge and looked back one last time, the horizon glowed faintly with the last light of the day. The cabin was just a shadow now, the desert stretching endlessly beyond it. But there was life there again, hidden among the stones and sand. It's the kind of life that waits, patient and steady, for those willing to see it. That night as I drove away, I thought about how easily we forget to listen to the land, to the past, to each other. Maybe that's what the chief wanted all along. Not vengeance or fear, but remembrance. A promise that we wouldn't let silence erase what matters. The road ahead was long, but the stars above felt closer than ever. I rolled down the window and let the cool desert wind fill the car. Somewhere behind me, the land rested, whole again, whispering softly through the night. And though I didn't look back, I knew it was still watching, still alive, still waiting for the next person who would listen.